This conference will now be recorded.
So everyone, welcome to our monthly webinar series. I'm Elizabeth Perez. I'm part of COMS and I'm helping with the webinars here. So today we have John Moynier. Correct me if I misspell that or mispronounce your name. And in this case, before we get started, I just wanted to thank our sponsor YSI, and we're gonna play a little video with a message from them, and then we'll get started with the webinar. Again, if you could all, seems like everyone's doing it, but if you could all mute yourselves and have the video off, that would be great. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have like 10 minutes for questions. So I'm just gonna go ahead and play this video.
Water quality field instrumentation. We strive to provide equipment that can last through extended deployments and—
Sorry, I'm going to start that again. Here we go.
Thank you for the opportunity to sponsor this webinar. YSI Incorporated, founded in Yellow Springs, Ohio, has a history focused on developing and manufacturing reliable water quality field instrumentation. We strive to provide equipment that can last through extended deployments and increase the time between servicing. We are continually working on improvements to our products and developing new sensor technology. YSI has over 250 employees based at the Yellow Springs manufacturing site, and in 2023, we will celebrate 75 years in business. In 2011, YSI became part of Xylem, sharing innovative technology across Xylem's brands and continuing our legacy of providing comprehensive, customer-focused solutions. YSI offers water quality sensor technology across a wide range of applications, from our simple single-parameter EcoSense line and photometers to the Pro Series family of sensors that offer single, dual, and multi-parameter handheld sampling options, to the ExoSON line that specializes in rugged, long-term monitoring for multiple parameters. YSI works with your site and monitoring requirements to implement custom real-time monitoring systems using buoys, telemetry, and even autonomous underwater vehicles. Reach out to us today at ysi.com to get started on solving your water monitoring needs. Thank you.
Great, thank you for this message. And now I am going to head and introduce our speaker, and we can get started with the webinar. So today's webinar is titled Keeping Your Assets Above Water, Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations to Help Deal with Climate Change and Impacts. And our speaker today is John Moynier. He's the Vice President with Parsons in the Pasadena office. He has over 40 years of experience managing integrated water resource, floodplain management, and environmental planning projects for clients throughout California and the Western United States. John began his career in operations and management of a local water agency and has been involved with many of the most complex water resource and supply projects and programs in the West over the past 30 years. He's a recognized subject matter expert in the fields of integrated water resource management, water supply assessment, floodplain management, and environmental planning, and he is a certified environmental professional and a certified floodplain manager. So without further ado, I'm gonna leave him to the talk and we can hear more about this.
Great, thank you, Ellie. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. My name is John Moynier. As Ellie said, I'm a vice president with Parsons, currently in the water wastewater, but also in the floodplain management and environmental analysis. And so I have to say that I'm a little nervous talking about lake management or reservoir management to the Lake Management Society. So please bear with me. We'll go through a little journey here as we talk about forecast informed reservoir operations and other tools to look at how we are moving, finally at least, into the 21st century in terms of reservoir operations. As far as what to expect, I'll go through a whole bunch of questions that I'll hopefully prompt some answers and maybe some additional questions as you guys get engaged over the course of this presentation. So when I submitted the abstract to Stephen and the crew here, we were talking about what's the word? What is important to lake management or reservoir management in today's world? And obviously climate change is a big part of that, and how climate change or climate variability affects our water supplies. And as you'll see as I go through this, it's even in today's news. So we'll cover that. And also, as you'll see, that the big word today is drought, and how we are responding to this historic, unprecedented levels of drought, and how we might have to cut back in water deliveries and manage our supplies differently. As you see, one of the most hotly debated topics that we have is water storage, and we'll go through what is that, what about the potential for new dams, and then how we might manage our existing dams and reservoirs differently to maximize both their storage capabilities while maintaining their flood risk reduction capabilities. And finally, we'll look at what we would call a paradigm shift in the way we've done this management of reservoirs differently as opposed to maybe over the last 100 years, and how we might apply technology. So thank you all from comms. If we didn't say, I'm a board member, I'm on the board of directors for the Floodplain Management Association, a certified floodplain manager, and firms like Parsons are deeply involved in applying technology to these new solutions of a paradigm shift. Can't be a water resources presentation without bringing up this alleged Mark Twain quote, "Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over." But it is obviously always a tension between water supply, water resource management, flood protection, and that's at the heart of this integrated water resource planning. As the governor announced at the end of May, that California is facing a drought crisis. The state board adopted emergency conservation regulations, and the governor has been asking all of us to step up and manage our water appropriately, including many agencies having to implement water use restrictions, and look at how we might manage our supplies differently to get through this current period. So what's in the news? Here's CNN last month. Climate change, drying up biggest reservoir in the United States. And they were talking about both the California system and the Colorado River system, and saying that Shasta Lake and Lake Oroville, two largest reservoirs in California, are facing historic struggle. Obviously, the climate has not been conducive to filling our reservoirs, and now they're at critically low levels at the point of the year when they should be highest. And you take that into the news yesterday, Los Angeles Times says a major California reservoir has hit its peak for the year at just over half full. State water officials say the lake is at 51% of capacity and 66% of its historical average for this point of the year, when it should be at its peak capacity. Obviously, Lake Oroville is a key element to the state water project, and so the whole state then depends upon what is going on in Lake Oroville as well as Lake Shasta and how we are managing those. So one of the things that's at the toolbox for the state as a result of Proposition 1, which was passed in 2014, is funding for Water Storage Investment Program, or WSIP. And WSIP is used for a bunch of different acronyms, but we're calling it for the Proposition 1, and looking at $2.7 billion for the 8 current projects that are on the list for funding by the California Water Commission for water storage. And again, these projects range from expanding existing reservoirs to boosting groundwater storage. And about half of these, 4 of these, involved our water resource or reservoir programs. The other half are groundwater storage programs. And I decided to limit to the 4 that are surface water programs. But basically, the California Water Commission is still investigating these. We're examining how they might best meet the state's needs. and then how they're going through all of the permitting and approval processes. So what's new? The Los Vaqueros expansion project, that's with Contra Costa Water District. That's considered $1 billion regional multi-agency water supply program. It involves not only Contra Costa Water District, but Valley Water, SFPUC, East Bay Mud, and as an essential part of the water supply forecasting or reliability program for at least for the East Bay, if not the entire Bay Area. So this is a current program ongoing, and recently those agencies formed a joint powers authority to better manage this program as it moves forward and expand the existing Los Vaqueros Reservoir from 160,000 acre feet storage capacity to 275,000 acre feet, and a number of different projects that get associated with it. So that's key to addressing our water storage and water resource planning programs, Los Vaqueros expansion. Again, with Valley Water, looking at a number of their reservoirs, but including Pacheco Reservoir is on the list, and that is to expand Pacheco Reservoir from 5,500 acre feet to 140,000 acre feet by building a 320-foot high earthen dam, hold enough water to supply 1.4 million people with water for 1 year in emergency. I was previously involved with a similar dam raise for the Ceni Dam down in San Diego County Water Authority, which doubled the height of that dam to provide both emergency storage and carryover storage in the event of either a seismic action or an extended drought. So building dams or raising dams is certainly a major component of the portfolio or tools available to addressing California's water needs. Another one on the list is Sites Reservoir, and this is an interesting characterization, a long dead proposal to flood a bucolic valley north of Sacramento and create a massive reservoir for thirsty Southern California. It's finding new life, much to the dismay of environmentalists. So Sites Reservoir being different, that it's not an on-stream reservoir, off-stream reservoir to be able to take water when it's plentiful, put it in the reservoir, and then be able to use it to supplement flows in the Sacramento River or supplement water supplies. So this is a controversial, as it notes in this headline, but it is one on the list, and we're looking at it as far as potential to be able to meet our needs in the future. Then finally on that list is the Temperance Flat Dam. Now this is a 2-year-old headline, Temperance Flat Dam put on the shelf indefinitely. Certainly new dams or expansion of dams are not an easy thing to pass through or get permitted or get approved. And this is how the San Joaquin Valley Water characterized this. It says the basic storage costs were staggering according to the analysis. So not everything is easy, even if it has the will of the people or the political pressure. So again, as I mentioned, talking to the Lake Management Society, I feel a little nervous about saying what's a lake, but I think it's at the heart of this. And so obviously you guys know what lakes are, beautiful, but one of the key things in here is the USGS defines this is that lakes are temporary storage places for water moving through the water cycle. And so that's key as we go into the examination, what's a reservoir. So lakes are highly valued, obviously, for recreational, aesthetic, scenic, and water supply qualities. Most are treasured of our natural resources. The key here is that human activities can further accelerate rates of change in terms of what those lakes and those resources can offer. But, however, human intervention, i.e. lake management practices, that's you guys, can sometimes control or even reverse detrimental changes. So we'll look at that here. Now, what's a reservoir? Well, a reservoir is the same thing as a lake in many people's minds, but a reservoir by definition is a man-made lake that is created typically on a river, although we saw with Sites Reservoir, it may be off-stream. And humans take water from reservoirs when they need it, which means their water levels change in ways that are very different from naturally occurring lakes, or at least in most cases. So here you have a picture of a small off-stream reservoir that's actually used to store captured stormwater, recycled water, and then used as a reservoir to capture a little bit of the flood damage from protection from the urbanized area, and this is in Orange County. And then it's going to be ultimately used to combine with other water sources for a future advanced water purification program. So what's a reservoir? Again, as I mentioned, many reservoirs are created by damming a pre-existing river, but even those can be resemble either a storage or a run-of-the-river system, depending on how they're managed. So storage reservoirs typically larger, have larger hydraulic heads, longer residence times, and allow for fine-tuned control. And we'll see many examples of storage reservoirs, but there also are run-of-river reservoirs that store less water and have relatively small hydraulic heads and little control over the rate that water is released from the dam. And those may be subject to sedimentation or other activities that may really affect their water storage capability. And then, as many of you know, or most of you know, reservoirs can also provide both water storage or flood control benefits, or both. Here's a picture of Folsom Reservoir and the new spillway that was added just in the last few years to be able to better handle releases to provide flood protection for Sacramento urban area, the metropolitan area downstream. So in this definition here, we're saying that while global expansion of reservoirs has increased access to drinking water, it's also changed in other aspects. It's fundamentally changed the movement of water. Obviously, if you dam a stream or river, you're going to change the movement of water. And changing this idea of the ecologically relevant differences between reservoirs and natural lakes is what lake management and CALMS is all about. And it's a daunting task because of the variability in both the ecosystems that they represent, the uses that they represent, and how those are managed. But further than that, as all of you are aware, and this gets back to the heart of those news stories I presented, California's weather is weird and it's wild. So what is normal? We are, even this last year, which is considered a drought year, we had historic rainfall and precipitation and even flooding, even in a drought year. And that is where California has more extreme precipitation years, dry and wet, per average than any other state. So there's a key element here, and that is recognizing that there's no such thing as normal in terms of California's precipitation. This chart on the left here shows basically 100 years of record for the April 1st, which is typically when we measure the snow water content in the Sierra snowpack. Over that 100 years, less than 10% of the years are within 10% of the long-term average, which is why I say there's no such thing as normal. We're actually governed by either feast or famine. These very heavy years of precipitation, mostly in the form of snow, again in the Sierra, versus years of drought. And if you look at this really, because it's skewed toward these heavy years, we're actually more in drought condition than we think because of that long-term normal. These pictures here, these satellite images, show just how different one year can be from another. From 2019, the February 18th snowpack, to 2020, and that drives our water storage story. So what's normal? How we manage flood risk and water storage when we have no such thing as normal in terms of precip. I'm going back to Folsom Lake. Again, here in 2011, the lake is basically full. It's managed for water storage by the Bureau of Reclamation, but it's also managed for flood protection by the Army Corps of Engineers. So it's a joint use facility. And you can see when the snowpack and the precipitation dwindles over that previous drought period, the lake itself will dry up. And those are the conditions that we're having again. But we also have flood. And that's something that has changed our regulation and our management of the lakes and reservoirs in recent times. Most of you remember the Oroville Dam Crisis. And as a result of that, in 2017, Senate Bill 92 was passed by the legislature as an emergency measure, and it became effective that very year, which added changes to the water code in terms of how we manage dams and how we address the emergency action planning and notification of the risk of dams. The state, under the Department of the Division of Safety of Dams and Department of Water Resources, manages actually over 1,200 dams and affected all of those. one way or another. California Water Code 6160 said that the dams, those dam owners are responsible for emergency preparedness. And so they have to address the risk of flooding and failure, as well as the management of water storage. Part of that was classification of the public safety risk of these dams and the risk of potential downstream hazard. And so this is something that's come up a lot in terms of communities being able to communicate, is there extremely high hazard, significant hazard, or low hazard for these dams, and how do you manage those dams to mitigate or address those? And one of the unfortunate aspects of having dams is that there is a risk of failure, as we saw with Oroville and other dams. And according to this, between 2000 and 2009, there were more than 200 notable dam failures worldwide. And in fact, international humanitarian law considers dams to be installations containing dangerous forces. So we are storing water behind these engineered facilities that are not supposed to fail, but there is a risk of failure. And so we have to balance that with our management for water supply. So how do we do that? How do we manage? Well, this keyword is now integrated water management is the new paradigm, trying to balance these two forces, water supply and flood protection. And as you see this chart going up through the pyramid, progressive program development, originally we were looking at forecast coordinated operations, and then we're moving into this forecast informed reservoir operations. And then ultimately Army Corps, which is responsible for flood protection, is looking at how does their manuals address the actual management of those dams. But of course, we're dealing with drought, we deal with flood, and we deal with long-term changes in climate. So another way of describing integrated resource management is this concept of one water, one watershed, where we no longer look at just potable water supply on one side and floodwaters or stormwaters on the other. Wastewater, recycled water, all water resources have to be considered in order to address things like drought as well as our long-term water supply. So it's coming up with a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, integrated thinking that has multiple benefits, and that's the pursuit for all of our projects. The goals of integrated water management planning are, as I said, to integrate that planning as early as possible, to look at all the different water resources, maximize stakeholder participation, seek multiple benefits, and then provide sustainable use of our water resources, combined with this co-equal goal that the environment has as equal voice as human needs. And again, this can mean indirect or even potable, direct potable reuse and storage of water. So this is now where the future is going. We're looking at all water resources are valuable. We can no longer sustain the old paradigm. So we go back to this idea of forecast coordinated operations. So we have these facilities, like in this case, this is looking at the wrong side of the Folsom Dam. And we look at how do we maximize the investments and any improvements that we make in these. So if we can incorporate forecasts, we can operate these dams better. The long-term paradigm was that we had these set in stone curves that said at this date, there should be this level. If not, we would release the water, even if we didn't see any chance of there being a large forecasted weather event in the future. Now we're moving towards where we can forecast a large event and release waters in advance of that event so that we can create more vacant space in the reservoir and attenuate peak flows. But on the flip side, if no storms are forecasted, water can be held in storage where it previously was released to make room for water that might never come. And so this is where we're making use of technology, better data collection, and better modeling to better manage our resources. And that leads us into more this forecast-informed reservoir operations, or FIRO. FIRO is a flexible water management approach where we use the data collected and put that into models using improved weather forecasting, which could be on a very micro scale, and that helps our water managers selectively retain or release water from our reservoirs to provide increased resilience to both droughts and floods. And you can see here in this case, or Lake Mendocino, the model here shows that with use of FIRO, you can actually increase storage by 19% over water storage that would have been released without the FIRO. So back to this idea of how do we manage. One of the other things in terms of the data collection is we're starting to see that changes are not only in this variability of the climate, but over time, the percent of runoff and actually available storage has been decreasing over time. And that requires us to go back and relook at those storage curves, those management curves that we have been using for years and years and years. And so now to be able to take that and improve our forecasting of stream flows and apply that to reservoir operations so that we can take these models and optimize the management of the reservoir, either for flood or water storage. And again, those models are improving too, so that now as the Army Corps is working on revising its methodology, starting to apply better data as well as better models to then refine how we look at these managements and be able to react much more quickly to real-time scenarios. Army Corps has put a lot of effort into improving the technology and the use of technology and integrating those resources. And there's a number of different centers where they've been applying that and in partnership with USGS, with NOAA, with FEMA, with the Bureau of Reclamation, and developing tools that be able to better manage our reservoirs and our water storage capabilities. As I said, the partnership extends beyond the federal government, goes to the state Department of Water Resources and to local agencies like Valley Water, Contra Costa, in Southern California, Metropolitan Water District, San Diego County Water Authority, and others, where we're even at the small level. This picture I've superimposed over the Army Corps' manual, which is the Mammoth Lakes Basin, which is where I used to manage the water district, where these small mountain lakes are actually have very small dams on them and used to control for surface water delivery. So these are reservoirs as well, even though they're seen to be a high mountain lake for recreation. So the idea of these tools, being able to apply the H&H or hydraulic and hydrologic modeling, dam safety, levee, all these integrated sources, integrated uses, improved data collection and management, and then putting them all together into tools that can be better used for our system. So I'm going to show you an example that I was involved in on the upper San Joaquin River watershed, where we used the real-time simulation modeling, or our HEC RTS, so the Hydraulic Engineering Center for the Army Corps, which the RTS is the PC-based version of their comprehensive water management system toolset. And so this program, this real-time simulation modeling program, ties together many of the existing HEC or HEC programs, as well as meteorological forecasting data, to be able to use this for IRWM planning, flood protection, prediction, water supply planning, environmental compliance, and other uses. So if you're not familiar with Big Creek, it is what was considered the hardest working water in the world. It's over 100 years. This was the first constructed. It was the first large integrated hydroelectric project. It's in the High Sierra, covers about 1 million acres, the upper San Joaquin River watershed just south of Yosemite National Park. It was begun in 1911, completed in 1995, and as an engineering challenge, it presented a greater challenge than building the Panama Canal. There's 6 major dams, over 500 million acre-feet of reservoir storage, 54 miles of tunnels, including the longest water tunnel in the world at the time, 9 powerhouses, 6,000 feet of hydraulic head, going from basically under 1,000 feet above sea level to almost 14,000 feet at the head of the watershed. But the dams cover much of the territory, again, between Yosemite National Park and Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. And it is the largest source of Southern California's green energy for SCE, Southern California Edison, about 1,000 megawatts. and it's about 1/3 of their total power generation. So they brought this program into play as a pilot program to develop a real-time numerical water resource model to provide a reasonable level of detail to simulate the hydrology and hydraulics of the watershed as it pertained to that energy developing hydroelectric system. And the goal ultimately was to maximize operation of that system by developing an automated, standardized, and consistent decision-making program. People still made the decisions, but they were much better informed about how to make the decisions to operate both for their water storage, their power generation, and for environmental uses. That pilot project involved 6 major tasks. Obviously, collecting data was really important, and turns out that data was not that available. In the early 50s and 60s, there was much more data being collected, both in terms of precipitation, snowmelt, stream gauge data, and over time, budget cuts had resulted in much of those data collection facilities being abandoned. And so getting back into the data collection became a huge part of it. Developing these meteorological forecast processors, or the MFP, and being able to apply that on a very small grid, which could take into account local rain shadow effects so that you didn't have this one blanket model for the entire 1 million acres watershed, was really important. And then taking that data and creating a hydrologic model for the streams, which is using HEC HMS, and then a reservoir simulation model for all of those water storage reservoirs using ResSim, and a hydraulic model for the streams to be able to understand how the channel hydraulics worked, and then putting all of those inputs together in this real-time simulation, or RTS model, to be able to provide a decision-making tool for the operators. This is kind of the chain of flow that it would use, and this would be the same for any of these FIRO or forecast informed reservoir operations models, where you're taking meteorological data, whether it's gridded or point data, you're making use of hydrology, reservoir simulation models, operations tools, HEC-RAS for river hydraulics, and other uses like these flood informed models or other uses, and then putting them all together in these comprehensive modeling tools that are now the key element of these forecast informed reservoir operations. So again, as I said, it's when you're dealing with the watershed the size of this, with the amount of terrain variability, even elevation difference, precipitation falling as either snow or rain on snow or rain, you have to divide this into areas or smaller pieces so that you can have a better idea where that those flows might come, and then put those all into these models. So being able to predict the inflows into a reservoir or a reservoir system to adapt to forecasted events, and then managing that against historic reservoir information data and flow data so that you can truth check it, is a key element of forecasted reservoir operations modeling. So ultimately, RTS or similar tools is a calibrated real-time simulation program taking all these model data and outputs and putting them into an integrated system for use for decision making. And I think that's where we are now. It's essentially bringing us into the 21st century, even though we're 2022. So that's one of the key elements, but what else is going on? Well, as all of you probably are aware, reservoir sedimentation is a significant issue with our operation of these reservoirs, especially some of these reservoirs are over 100 years old. And as noted by the National Reservoir Sedimentation and Sustainability Team, or the NRSST, we need long-term sediment management strategies to preserve the benefits of our nation's resources. And we're starting to see significant reduction in water storage as a result of sedimentation. As it says here, the accumulation of sediment is a serious problem in many parts of the world and has severe consequences for water management, flood control, and production of energy. It looks like that by their data analysis, the loss in reservoir storage capacity is somewhere between 0.5% and 1% a year. So this is something that very much needs to be addressed, and maybe some of you have been participants in the NRSST evaluation and analysis. So as it notes here, in the United States, reservoirs are functioning as originally planned, which means they trap water and they trap sediment. And people may not be aware that the numerous benefits of the reservoir are not sustainable if we don't implement a sediment management plan. So one of the things that we've looked at previously was building new reservoirs with the application of these public funds. But there's also a strong movement about to not build a new one, but fix the old one. And that is, how can we manage our reservoirs to either reduce or address the sediment loading that is reducing the reservoir storage capacity in our nation's dams. So reservoirs today are quite well built, but their performance can be affected by activities like deforestation, pollution, natural erosion, which result in sediment washing in the reservoir. This accumulates the bottom reservoir, as it's supposed to do, taking up space that water otherwise could use. So how do we address so that these investments, these storage capacities in our reservoirs can be available for future generations? Well, there's a broad range of tools available in terms of that as well. And it's not just dredging or removing the sediment, but also controlling the way that the sediment flows into these reservoirs, reducing soil erosion on the watershed itself, and then that reduces sediment inflow, routing, and being able to take that sediment that needs to get downstream and ultimately to the ocean and get it back into the system where while you're still maintaining the capacity of the reservoir. Another way to look at this again, this is just the same kind of idea where there are a number of tools available to sustainably manage our reservoirs in terms of the sediment that's flowing into them, but still needs to be naturally involved in the system, but just not being captured by the reservoir. And so if we don't manage the sediment loading of our reservoirs, then dam removal is often the eventual outcome and can be the expensive outcome if we don't manage that. So even after a dam removal, there's still a significant quantities of sediments may remain in the reservoir, which will likely render the area unsuitable for water storage. So just removing a dam that has been fully sediment loaded is not necessarily just the simple answer, and you'll see that here in a second, but it is something that sometimes we have to address. And then, as I mentioned earlier, dredging is an important and well-established method of removing sediments. So this is something that if we can restore the storage capacity in a reservoir, we may be able to greatly extend the life of that reservoir and restore some of that storage capacity. If we don't manage it otherwise, we will lose. And here's a picture of Matilda Reservoir, which is upstream of Ventura, which is in the process of being loaded, as you can see here, by sediment. It captures both the water on the stream, but also the sediment flowing down here. And so it says here, the sustainable management of reservoir sediment may seem expensive, but it's much less than the cost that would compare to eventually losing the reservoir benefits and the removal of that dam. So whereas the 20th century focused on the construction of new dams, the 21st century will be necessarily focusing on combating sedimentation to extend the life of existing infrastructure. And this task will be greatly facilitated as we start today. So all reservoirs formed by dams and natural water courses are subject to some degree of sediment inflow and deposition, and we need to recognize it. Otherwise, without that active management, that sediment will eventually fill up the storage volume behind the dam, remove or displace the water storage volume behind the reservoir, and ultimately render it useless. That happens, we either need to notch the dam or remove it completely. In addition, long before the reservoir lost its capacity, we need to address those things that are bringing the sediment into the system itself, so that it's not just a matter of removing the sediment, but managing it completely before it removes our water supply, buries the dam outlets, and clogs the intakes for water supply and power production. But if that doesn't work, then just get rid of it, damn it. And I've been involved in a couple of those dam removal projects. This one is the town of St. Helena in Napa County. So the waters of York Creek This dam was built over 100 years ago, and over time that sediment was not managed, and the sediment completely filled the reservoir space behind the dam, became a flow over the dam, and ultimately it became a barrier to fish passage and the natural recruitment of sediment. So after 27 years of starts and stops, lawsuits brought by multiple entities, court orders, long-running fines, they finally decided to remove that dam. And this was just a year ago, they completed the removal of the dam and the sediment. So this is now a tributary to the Napa River, and steelhead have already began moving upstream to their historic spawning grounds. Another dam like this that is also in the same kind of scenario is on Malibu Creek. And this is the Ringe Dam upstream of Malibu Lagoon. It is completely filled with sediment, no longer provides any storage. Malibu Creek now is past, just flows around the dam itself. And it provides a barrier to federally endangered southern steelhead and other species to reaching their spawning and rearing grounds. So in this case, Caltrout has been proposing that this dam will be the next to be removed. So what do you guys think? Obviously, you're very concerned and passionate about lake management, reservoir management. So here we are. We're looking at what are the tools available? What science can we use? What type of processes can we implement to better manage our resources in terms of our reservoirs, our lakes, our water storage, our flood protection? We have to look at various things that are available and then be able to take advantage of the technology that's we have access to now in the 21st century. So the problem with that is that public engagement is a messy process. As a famous writer once said, one man alone can be pretty dumb, but for real bona fide stupidity, ain't nothing can beat teamwork. So that's the monkey wrench gang. And that's what happens when we do bring in all of our stakeholders and seek public engagement, but it's a vital process to getting everyone to be involved in this. And the practice of involving members of the public in the agenda setting, decision-making, and policy-forming activities, that's critical to the ultimate success of a project, especially when we're spending public funds. So with that, I'll leave you with this thought here, which is very sage Benjamin Franklin saying, when the well is dry, we shall know the value of water. And I would apply that to when the reservoir is empty, we shall know the value of water. So with that, I'll open it to questions, but thank you guys.
Thank you, Jen. That was a great talk. We do have a couple questions here on the chat. The first one is from Chris Berry. He's asking if dredging really a viable alternative, and if Chris, if you want to unmute and elaborate, feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I don't really have much to add to that other than that idea has come up a bunch of times for our reservoir, and mostly people have said, seriously, like, how are you going to do that? So perhaps other reservoirs with better access might stand a better chance, but I just wonder if we're talking about like Lake Powell and that kind of stuff, how much of a dent can we really put in that sediment load with dredging? Just curious.
Well, I've looked at small, so thanks, Chris. And I've looked at small reservoirs, and that is a much better chance of being able to restore the water storage capacity, and especially to be able to move the sediment. The Ringe Dam that I presented at the very end of that slide, the sediment transport is the most critical aspect, is how do you deal with the sediment that's trapped behind that dam? And on Malibu Creek, it's a relatively small amount, but if you have to move it by truck load, the amount of vehicle trips, the amount of carbon produced, all of those things become environmental issues associated with it that have to be considered. And if you're talking about Lake Powell and the Colorado River, flushing that sediment downstream so then it just fills into Lake Mead, or eventually gets down into the delta of the Colorado River, that's a much more serious issue in terms of sediment removal and how does that you reverse those decades of sediment loading. But it is something that needs to be addressed at least at a smaller scale reservoirs. So hopefully that answered that question, but it is something that is part of the toolbox but has to be considered.
Thank you. Another question that we have is, during extreme drought, would the bottoming of the reservoirs provide an opportunity to address the sediment buildup? And are there regulatory constraints for dredging, whether the bottoming of the reservoirs occur?
Well, as I just mentioned, I mean, I guess that can take advantage of low water levels in these reservoirs to be able to access the sediments that are exposed. You have to consider, I see Fred Lee on here, I know he's an expert in the potential trapped contaminants that are in these sediments. And so you have to deal with how do you dispose of those sediments once you excavate them. And again, I talked about how do you transport them without creating a bigger environmental fiasco, so to speak, in terms of just truckload after truckload. But the alternative is sometimes it's presented is that if you were to just flush it down the stream, you would have a one-time impact, move that transport down by, say, breaching a dam and allowing the sediment to flush out and eventually reach the ocean. But you'd be dealing with sediment loading in those downstream areas for years and years to come too. So there's no easy answer, but it is one part of it that I think that we have to look at. But if you have access to a place to either dispose of, store, use, or flush to the ocean, transporting the sediment out that's trapped at the bottom of the reservoir when it's exposed during these droughts is an opportunity that we have to examine.
Thank you. And this last question is somewhat related. They want to know, should dredging be a proactive part of the reservoir management plans that occur regularly, which I think you talked about this, but they're specifically wondering about systems like the Matilda that are so silted in, so the prospect of releasing it all downstream would fundamentally change the water quality downstream and the beneficial uses of the tilled water. So what can be done in those systems about existing sediment?
Well, I think that the intermediate ground is notching these reservoirs, and I think that's being considered by the water resource managers, where you can restore some of the traditional flows in the streams where they have been interrupted by the dam itself, and be able to allow some of the natural sediment transport. And if you do that in a progressive manner, you can, over a period of many, many years, remove the sediment by more natural processes and allow it to be flushed downstream. But again, you have to look at what is that impacts to those downstream areas. And so one of the issues that was going on Upper York Creek was that there would be periodic floods that would then take those sediments that were trapped by the dam and flush them downstream, which would not be a normal natural scenario. And it was actually the loading, sediment loading, the sand and the steelhead rearing beds downstream and impacting. So there was at least 4 major fish kill incidences where sediments had been removed by a flood from this sediment filled dam and then washed downstream. So ultimately we have to look at what are the costs of not doing anything, what are the costs of these various alternatives available to us, and then, ultimately, how do we deal with both of the economic and environmental issues associated?
Thank you, John. I don't know if anyone else have any other questions. There's no more questions in the chat.
Well, if not, thank you all very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys and address this. And I'm looking for you guys to be taking these types of issues and building the solutions. And I know many of you are managing agencies, you're working with agencies where you're dealing with this on a daily basis. And I thank you for that. And I respect you guys greatly. So thank you all for allowing me the chance to address you guys.
Thank you, John, for sharing your expertise with us. I guess before we wrap up, just want to say this is like the last webinar series or webinar that we're going to have from the webinar series for a while. Our next big event would be the Columns Conference in the fall, and Mark was going to talk a little bit about it before we let you all go.
Can you all hear me? Great,
Yep.
thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick plug. We have scheduled the Columns Conference for 2022. It's going to be in Oakland on October 13th and 14th. And we have a bunch of really good talks planned so far. We have talks on some of the reservoir projects we talked about today, on some creek lake separation projects, on managing reservoir outflow for fisheries, and some kind of more interesting limnology and hydrodynamics talks. And so, yeah, we're going to have a multi-session event this year and a great banquet that's going to be at Lake Merritt. So I definitely encourage everybody to check out our website, and you can register there. If you work for the industry, you guys can sponsor our conference and come and show people your product or your service. And we also have a call for abstracts. So if you have some recent research that you'd like to present on to our group, then we'd welcome that. So yeah, please visit our website and hope to see you there.
Yeah, I hope to see you out there, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop.